Freedom. It is one of the most spoken words in human history, and one of the least experienced realities. Everyone claims to want freedom. Kings, empires, revolutionaries, even tyrants. And yet, there is a strange pattern that repeats itself across time. The moment freedom appears, fear follows. This video is not an accusation. It is not a manifesto. It is a question. Why has freedom throughout history almost always been built on fear? When we open history books, freedom never emerges during calm and stable times. Freedom is born after war, after famine, after oppression, after blood has already been spilled. Freedom appears at the breaking point, when fear becomes unbearable. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. Freedom is demanding. To be free means to decide, to choose, to take responsibility for consequences. Fear, on the other hand, offers something deeply tempting: relief from responsibility. When people are afraid, they obey. When they obey, they feel protected. And history has learned how to use this. Let us go back to the earliest human communities. Early humans were not free, but they were not enslaved either. They lived in a world ruled by danger, hunger, cold, predators, other humans. Nature did not offer freedom, it offered threat. In such a world, survival mattered more than liberty. People gathered together not to be free, but to be safer. Rules emerged, leaders appeared, hierarchy formed, and those leaders were not chosen for kindness. They were chosen for strength, for dominance, for the ability to intimidate, because fear creates order faster than trust ever could. This is the first paradox of freedom. Human beings did not unite to gain freedom. They united to reduce fear. As societies grew, this mechanism did not disappear. It simply became more sophisticated. Fear turned into law. Law turned into authority. Authority turned into the state. And freedom remained conditional. Philosophers tell us that freedom is humanity's highest value. History tells us something darker. People fight for freedom only after it is taken away. Freedom is rarely protected proactively. It is defended reactively. We do not feel freedom when we have it. We only recognize it when it disappears. And that delay is dangerous, because freedom becomes an emergency response, not a guiding principle. Look at every major movement for freedom in history. The French Revolution did not begin with philosophy. It began with fear of starvation. American independence did not begin with ideals alone. It began with fear of external control. The abolition of slavery did not begin with abstract morality. It began with the unbearable reality of total dehumanization. Freedom was never the first motivation. Fear was. Freedom was the answer to fear. Here lies the second paradox. People do not seek freedom because they love it. They seek freedom because they can no longer tolerate fear. Freedom becomes an escape route, not a destination. Now we arrive at a far more uncomfortable question. If freedom is born from fear, what happens to fear once freedom is achieved? History gives a clear answer. Fear does not disappear, it transforms. Fear once had a face, a king, an emperor, a ruler. Then fear became law. Then fear became institutions. Today, fear is invisible, but it is everywhere. Modern humans believe they are free, yet they are monitored, measured, categorized, conditioned. Freedom exists, but within boundaries. Is this freedom, or is it fear redesigned to feel acceptable? Throughout history, freedom has never been absolute, because absolute freedom requires absolute responsibility, and responsibility is heavy. Fear, by contrast, is comfortable. Fear allows decisions to be outsourced, to systems, to leaders, to structures. This is not a flaw. It is human nature. Fear protects us, but it also makes us governable. This documentary will not try to prove a single theory. Instead, it will follow a single question. From the first human communities to modern surveillance states, from primitive fear to digital control, Why does freedom always begin with fear, and why does it never fully escape it? Perhaps the problem is not freedom itself. Perhaps the problem is that we remember freedom only after fear has already shaped the world. Now, let us return to the beginning, to a time before freedom had a name, when fear already ruled. Because this story starts there. Before freedom was imagined, before it was named, before it became an ideal, human life was shaped by something far more immediate: fear. Early human societies did not debate liberty. They did not discuss rights. They did not ask philosophical questions about autonomy. They asked only one question: how do we survive tomorrow? A world without safety. The primitive world was not neutral, it was hostile. Hunger was constant, cold was merciless. Predators were everywhere. Other humans were unpredictable. Nature did not negotiate. It punished mistakes immediately. In such a world, freedom was not a gift. Freedom was a threat. To act freely meant to act alone, and to act alone often meant death. Individual freedom was a liability. In modern thinking, freedom is empowering. In primitive society, it was dangerous. An individual who acted independently, who ignored the group, who made decisions alone, was more likely to die. Freedom meant exposure. Exposure meant vulnerability. The group, not the individual, was the unit of survival, and survival demanded obedience. Why humans gathered humans did not form groups because they loved cooperation. They formed groups because they feared isolation. A group meant shared food, shared defense, shared vigilance, but a group also required rules, and rules require enforcement. This is where fear became organized. The birth of authority. The first leaders were not philosophers. They were not elected. They were not moral guides. They were the strongest, the loudest, the most intimidating. Why? Because fear works faster than trust. In moments of danger, people follow strength, not kindness. Authority was born not from wisdom, but from the ability to command fear. Order before freedom. Primitive societies needed order more than liberty. Order meant predictable behavior, shared expectations, controlled aggression. Freedom threatened that order. If everyone acted freely, the group fractured. So freedom was suppressed, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. This is an uncomfortable truth. The earliest human laws existed to limit freedom, not protect it. Fear as social glue. Fear was not just an emotion, it was a tool. Fear of predators, fear of punishment, fear of exile. Exile, especially, was a death sentence. To be cast out of the group meant exposure to the world alone. So obedience was rewarded, deviation was punished. Fear held society together. The psychological shift over time. Fear became internalized. People did not need to be constantly threatened. They learned the rules. They followed them instinctively. Fear transformed from an external force into an internal guide. This is crucial. It marks the moment when humans stopped needing chains and began governing themselves. Freedom had no value. Yet in this stage of history, freedom had no moral weight. It was not noble, it was not sacred, it was impractical. Freedom did not feed you, freedom did not protect you, freedom did not warn you of danger. The group did, so the group mattered more than the self. The first great trade. This was the first major trade in human history. Freedom in exchange for safety. It was not written, it was not negotiated, it was instinctive. And once made, it shaped everything that followed. The origin of the paradox. Here lies the root of the paradox we still live with. Humans learned to survive by surrendering freedom. Later, they would spend history trying to reclaim it, but the memory of fear never disappeared. It stayed embedded in our systems, our institutions, our psychology, a pattern that never left us. Even as societies grew more complex, the pattern remained. Fear to order, to stability, freedom to risk, to chaos. This logic would be repeated in ancient empires, religious systems, monarchies, modern states. Primitive fear never vanished. It evolved. Final reflection on primitive society. Primitive humans were not ignorant. They were rational within their environment. Freedom was a luxury they could not afford. Fear was not a weakness. It was a survival strategy, and that strategy worked. Humanity survived, but it survived at a cost we are still paying. Freedom did not disappear. It simply went underground, waiting for a moment when fear would grow so intense that humans would once again risk everything to escape it. And that moment would come. Fear did not disappear when humans began living together. It changed form. What was once fear of nature slowly became fear of each other. As communities grew larger, danger no longer came only from predators or hunger, but from human unpredictability itself. A larger group meant more mouths to feed, more conflicts to resolve, more impulses to control, and fear returned. Not as chaos, but as instability. Humans quickly learned a difficult lesson. A group without rules does not remain a group for long. Uncontrolled freedom produced violence. Violence produced retaliation. Retaliation produced endless cycles of fear. So something new had to appear. Something artificial, something imposed. That thing was law. Law did not emerge as a moral ideal. It emerged as a survival mechanism. The earliest laws were not about justice. They were about predictability. They answered one essential question: what will happen if I do this? Fear needed structure. Law provided it. Punishment became standardized. Revenge became regulated. Violence became controlled. Not eliminated, controlled. At this stage, fear became organized. Instead of fearing everyone, people learned to fear consequences. Instead of fearing chaos, they feared violation. This was a psychological shift of enormous importance. Fear moved from the outside world into the mind. Law did something crucial. It replaced immediate danger with delayed punishment. And delayed punishment is powerful. It allows fear to work quietly without constant force. People began to regulate themselves because they knew what awaited them. This was more efficient than violence. But law alone was not enough. Laws require enforcement. Enforcement requires authority. Authority requires legitimacy. And legitimacy requires power. Thus, the state was born. The state did not arise from freedom. It arose from fear of disorder. It promised safety. It promised stability. It promised continuity. In exchange, it demanded obedience. This was not framed as oppression. It was framed as protection, and people accepted it willingly. The state centralized fear. Instead of many threats, there was one system. Instead of unpredictable violence, there was regulated force. Instead of personal revenge, there was institutional punishment. Fear became distant but unavoidable. Here lies a critical transformation. Fear stopped being emotional and became structural. You did not need to feel afraid all the time. You only needed to know that punishment existed. The presence of law made fear permanent even when invisible. The state refined fear further. It created symbols, courts, uniforms, documents, borders. These were not merely administrative tools. They were psychological signals. They reminded people that power was watching, even when no one was present. Over time, obedience became habit. People followed rules not because they agreed with them, but because they were accustomed to them. Fear no longer required force. It required memory. Memory of consequences, memory of exclusion, memory of punishment. This is where freedom changed meaning. Freedom was no longer absolute action. It became permitted action. You were free, within limits. and those limits were defined by law, enforced by the state, justified by fear. The state claimed neutrality. It presented itself as rational, necessary, inevitable. But beneath its structure remained the same ancient logic. Unregulated freedom leads to danger. Danger leads to fear. Fear demands control. Philosophers later gave this logic names. Thomas Hobbes would call it the escape from chaos. The Leviathan would protect people from each other at the cost of freedom. But long before philosophy described it, humans had already lived it. Fear created law. Law created the state, and the state preserved fear in quieter, more efficient forms. This cycle did not end. It stabilized, and stability became civilization. But something was lost in the process. Freedom became conditional. Choice became regulated. Responsibility was transferred upward. People were no longer fully free, but they were safer, and safety felt convincing. This is the deepest irony of political history. The structures meant to protect humanity were built from the same fear that once threatened it. The tools changed. The logic did not. Even today, modern states still operate on this foundation. The language is different. The systems are more complex. The fear is less visible. But the exchange remains the same. Security in return for obedience. Order in return for limitation. And this is why freedom, from its very beginning, was never born pure. It was negotiated, it was compromised, it was shaped by fear. And yet, history does not stop here, because fear can control, but it cannot inspire. At some point, fear becomes unbearable again. And when that happens, humans do something dangerous. Ancient empires did not deny freedom, they redefined it. Freedom was never abolished. It was restricted, filtered, and distributed only to those who proved their loyalty. In the ancient world, freedom was not a human condition, it was a privilege. Empires emerged when fear alone was no longer enough to control people. Fear creates obedience, but obedience without reward eventually collapses. So empires invented a balance: fear for the many, freedom for the few. This balance allowed vast territories, diverse cultures, and millions of people to exist under a single authority. Rome, freedom as citizenship. In Rome, freedom did exist, but it was called civitas. A Roman citizen could vote, own property, appeal to courts, and live under the protection of Roman law. But citizenship was not universal. Most people in the empire were not free in this sense. Slaves had no freedom. Foreigners had limited freedom. Conquered peoples had conditional freedom. Rome did not rule by erasing freedom. It ruled by rationing it. If you obeyed Rome, paid taxes, served in its armies, and accepted its authority, your life was protected. If you resisted, freedom vanished immediately. Crucifixion, exile, enslavement. These were not acts of cruelty alone. They were messages. Rome's message was simple. Freedom exists, but only inside the system. Persia, tolerance as control. The Persian empires appeared more tolerant. They allowed religions to continue, languages to survive, local customs to exist. But this tolerance was strategic. Persia did not ask for belief. It asked for obedience. As long as tribute flowed and rebellion did not occur, people were left alone. Freedom existed, but it was fragile. The moment loyalty wavered, tolerance ended. Thus, even mercy was conditional. Sparta, freedom through discipline. Sparta offered one of the most extreme examples. Only Spartan warriors were free. Freedom was earned through absolute submission to the state. From childhood, Spartans were trained to obey orders, suppress emotion, and sacrifice individuality. Paradoxically, only those who surrendered all personal freedom were considered free citizens. Helots, the enslaved population, existed so Spartan freedom could exist. Here, freedom was not absence of control. It was total alignment with control. China, order over liberty. In ancient China, particularly under legalist philosophy, order mattered more than individual autonomy. The state promised stability, harmony, and survival, not freedom. Law was harsh. Punishment was severe. Mercy was rare. Why? Because the state believed fear created order, and order created longevity. Freedom was seen as disorder. Disorder was seen as collapse. Thus, freedom was sacrificed so the empire could endure. The empire's core logic. Despite cultural differences, all ancient empires shared the same psychological foundation. Uncontrolled freedom threatens unity. Unity requires obedience. Obedience must be rewarded selectively. Freedom became a tool, not a right. It was used to motivate loyalty, divide populations, justify hierarchy. Those closer to power had more freedom. Those farther away had less. Law as imperial boundary. Imperial law did not exist to protect everyone equally. It existed to define who mattered. Law marked the line between citizen and subject, loyal and rebellious. Useful and expendable freedom lived on one side of that line. Punishment as public theater empires understood something crucial. Punishment must be visible. Executions, exile, public humiliation. These were not only penalties, they were lessons. They taught people what happened when obedience ended. Fear reinforced law. Law reinforced obedience. Obedience preserved the empire. Freedom as illusion. For many inside empires, life felt stable. Roads existed. Markets functioned. Peace was enforced. This stability felt like freedom, but it was conditional peace. A peace that depended on compliance. The illusion of freedom worked because most people did not challenge it. The silent cost. What empires gained in stability, they lost in humanity. Individual conscience was suppressed. Dissent became treason. Difference became danger. Freedom was no longer about choice. It was about permission. Why empires eventually fell. Empires collapse not because fear disappears, but because fear becomes ineffective. When punishment no longer terrifies, when obedience no longer rewards, the illusion of freedom shatters. And people remember something dangerous. That freedom was never truly given. It was loaned. Ancient empires did not hate freedom. They feared it. They understood that real freedom creates unpredictability, and unpredictability threatens power, so they allowed freedom only when it served control. But history did not stop at empires. When fear could no longer be maintained only through soldiers, walls, laws, and visible punishment, when empires realized that controlling bodies was not enough to secure obedience across generations, religion emerged as a far more enduring system of authority, one that did not need constant violence because it learned how to place fear inside the human conscience, turning control into something internal, invisible, and self-sustaining. In religious societies, freedom was not removed outright because removal creates resistance. Instead, freedom was postponed, delayed, and reframed as something impure in the present world, but perfect in the next. Something dangerous when exercised freely on earth, yet sacred when promised beyond life, which allowed fear to stretch infinitely into the future without ever losing its power. Sin became the defining boundary of behavior, not as a simple list of forbidden actions, but as a moral lens through which every thought, desire, and intention could be judged, meaning that even when no authority was present, even when no law was being enforced, even when no punishment was visible, fear remained active because the individual learned to police themselves, to monitor their own impulses, to feel anxiety not only for what they did, but for what they wanted. This was a fundamental shift in the history of control, because fear no longer depended on immediate danger. It depended on eternal consequence, and eternity does not expire, does not weaken, does not forget, which made obedience far more stable than any empire could achieve. through force alone. Freedom, under religious logic, was not the ability to choose without restriction, but the ability to surrender correctly, because choice itself was framed as temptation, desire as corruption, and independence as moral risk. So the truly free person was not the one who acted openly, but the one who obeyed silently, who accepted limits willingly, who disciplined their thoughts before they ever became actions. Guilt replaced punishment as the primary regulator of behavior, because guilt does not require guards, does not require prisons, does not require public executions. It simply lives in memory, in habit, in fear of judgment that may never come in this life but is guaranteed in the next, which made resistance not only dangerous but sinful, not only illegal but immoral. Religion solved a problem that empires could not, because empires struggled to explain suffering, but religion gave suffering meaning, telling people that pain was not evidence of injustice but proof of faith, that endurance was virtue, that obedience was rewarded not here but later, which made rebellion feel pointless and patience feel holy. Freedom was transformed into a spiritual condition rather than a social one, meaning that a person could be oppressed, controlled, impoverished, and still be told they were free, as long as their soul was aligned with divine law, which disconnected freedom from material reality and placed it entirely beyond human reach. As religious authority merged with political power, kings ruled not only by force but by divine legitimacy. Laws were framed as sacred commands, and disobedience became heresy, which meant that opposing power was no longer just rebellion against a ruler, but rebellion against the cosmic order itself, making fear absolute and resistance existentially dangerous. What made this system so effective was not cruelty but consistency, because fear supported by meaning lasts longer than fear enforced by violence, and guilt outlives punishment. And internalized control does not require supervision, which allowed societies to regulate behavior even in silence, even in isolation, even in thought. The cost of this system was subtle but immense, because curiosity became suspicion, doubt became weakness, questioning became transgression, and freedom of thought quietly disappeared long before freedom of action ever did, leaving behind a society that appeared stable while remaining internally constrained. Even as modern societies began to separate religion from state, the structure remained because fear learned how to change language without changing function, replacing sin with shame, heresy with deviance, divine judgment with social exclusion, while continuing to shape behavior through internal pressure rather than external force. Religion did not destroy freedom. It reshaped it into something distant, conditional, and morally supervised, teaching humanity that freedom without fear was dangerous, that obedience was virtue, and that true liberation was never meant to be experienced fully in the present. And in doing so, it created one of the most enduring paradoxes in human history, that freedom was promised most strongly where it was practiced the least, and feared most intensely where it was claimed to be sacred. Revolutions do not begin with freedom, even though they always speak its name, because what truly ignites a revolution is not hope, but fear pushed beyond endurance. Fear that has accumulated quietly for years under obedience, law, religion, and hierarchy, until one day obedience collapses and fear turns outward instead of inward. People do not rise because they suddenly love liberty more than yesterday. They rise because fear has changed direction, because the fear of punishment, poverty, hunger, humiliation, or invisibility becomes weaker than the fear of continuing to live as they have been living. And at that precise moment, freedom appears not as a philosophy, but as an emergency exit. Every revolution begins as a refusal, not as a vision, a refusal to accept the existing order, a refusal to obey laws that no longer protect, a refusal to fear the institutions that once maintained stability. And this refusal is always chaotic because fear does not disappear when power collapses. It simply loses its original target. When authority breaks, fear does not vanish, it multiplies, because the structures that once controlled violence no longer function, and uncertainty replaces order, and uncertainty is one of the most terrifying conditions the human mind can experience, which is why revolutions almost immediately generate anxiety, even among those who demanded them. Freedom, in the revolutionary moment, is undefined, unstable, and frightening, because it removes familiar limits without providing new ones, and human beings, conditioned by centuries of obedience, often do not know how to act without structure, which creates a dangerous vacuum where suspicion grows faster than trust, and fear seeks new enemies. This is where terror is born, not as a betrayal of revolution, but as its shadow, because when fear no longer flows downward from power to people, it begins to circulate horizontally among the people themselves, turning neighbors into threats, dissent into danger, and disagreement into treason. The French Revolution demonstrates this pattern with brutal clarity, because the collapse of monarchy did not eliminate fear, it redistributed it, transforming fear of the king into fear of chaos, fear of counter-revolution, fear of betrayal, fear of hidden enemies, until violence became a form of reassurance and execution became a way to restore certainty. The guillotine was not only an instrument of death, it was an instrument of psychological control, because it offered a visible answer to invisible fear, showing the population that order still existed, that power was still capable of acting, that chaos was being punished, even if the punishment now came from the revolution itself. Freedom at this stage became conditional again, because only those who aligned perfectly with revolutionary ideals were considered free, while those who hesitated, questioned, or deviated were labeled enemies of liberty, proving once more that freedom defined by fear always requires exclusion. Revolutionary terror is not accidental, it is structural, because a movement born from fear struggles to govern without it. And when new institutions are weak, fear becomes the fastest tool to enforce unity, discipline, and obedience, even when those enforcing it once opposed fear themselves. This pattern repeats across history because revolutions promise freedom but inherit the psychological scars of the systems they overthrow, and these scars manifest as paranoia, authoritarian reflexes, and intolerance toward uncertainty, all of which push revolutionary movements toward repression, even as they speak the language of liberation. What makes revolutions tragic rather than simply violent is that terror is often justified as temporary, necessary, and protective, framed as a sacrifice required to secure freedom for the future, which allows violence to continue while preserving moral self-belief among those who carry it out. Freedom becomes postponed once again, delayed until stability is achieved, delayed until enemies are eliminated, delayed until the revolution is safe. And history shows that this delay often becomes permanent because fear, once normalized, is difficult to abandon. Revolutions reveal a harsh truth about human psychology, which is that people are willing to destroy oppressive systems, but they are far less prepared to live without systems at all. And when structure collapses faster than fear dissipates, terror fills the gap. The same fear that once enforced obedience under kings now enforces conformity under revolutionary committees. The same logic that justified punishment under empire now justifies punishment under ideology, and the same promise is repeated with different words. Endure now, freedom will come later. Freedom, when born from fear, struggles to survive fear because it was never taught how to exist independently of it, and terror becomes the unintended continuation of the very logic the revolution sought to escape. Revolutions therefore stand as both humanity's boldest act of resistance and its most revealing psychological confession, exposing not only the cruelty of power but the deep discomfort people feel when power dissolves and responsibility becomes unavoidable. The tragedy is not that revolutions fail to create freedom immediately, but that they reveal how deeply fear is embedded in the human understanding of order, security, and meaning, making freedom feel dangerous even when it is desired. And so history records this paradox again and again, that revolutions are born in the name of freedom but governed by fear, and that terror is not the opposite of revolution, but its unresolved inheritance. Modern states no longer rely on public executions, burning squares, visible chains, or overt brutality to maintain control, because fear in its raw form is unstable and generates resistance, and instead they have perfected a far more efficient system in which fear is dispersed, normalized, bureaucratized, and made almost imperceptible, so that individuals rarely feel terrified, yet constantly feel cautious, evaluated, and constrained. In the modern world, fear is no longer an event, it is an atmosphere, something that does not shock but surrounds, something that does not scream but whispers, something that does not punish immediately but reminds quietly, shaping behavior not through violence but through anticipation, calculation, and self-adjustment. The modern state does not need to threaten you openly because it has learned that uncertainty is more powerful than certainty, and that a population that never knows exactly where the boundary lies will regulate itself more carefully than one that does, which is why modern fear operates through ambiguity rather than command. Surveillance no longer requires guards on towers or soldiers on streets because technology has allowed observation to dissolve into everyday life, into cameras that feel ordinary, data collection that feels abstract, algorithms that feel neutral, and systems that claim efficiency rather than authority, while quietly transforming visibility into vulnerability. What makes this fear invisible is that it is rarely experienced as fear at all, because it presents itself as convenience, safety, optimization, protection, and order, encouraging individuals to accept monitoring not as coercion but as participation, not as control but as service. The modern citizen is not forced to obey. They are incentivized to comply, nudged to conform, guided to choose correctly, rewarded for alignment, and subtly discouraged from deviation, creating a system in which freedom technically exists but operates only within carefully engineered pathways. Law in the modern state is no longer primarily punitive. It is procedural, administrative, and omnipresent, embedding itself into forms, permits, ratings, scores, approvals, and classifications, turning everyday life into a sequence of permissions that appear neutral yet silently regulate behavior. Punishment, when it occurs, is often delayed, impersonal, and abstract, appearing as denial of opportunity, loss of access, reputational damage, exclusion from systems, or algorithmic invisibility, which makes fear diffuse and difficult to locate because one rarely knows exactly when disobedience turns into consequence. This form of fear is powerful precisely because it does not feel violent, because it does not require belief in ideology or loyalty to rulers, because it does not ask for faith, only compliance, and because it allows individuals to believe they are acting freely while constantly adapting to invisible constraints. The modern state rarely says, "you must," but constantly implies, "this is advisable, this is acceptable, this is normal," and deviation from these norms does not bring immediate punishment, but produces anxiety, uncertainty, and risk, which slowly disciplines behavior without ever needing to assert authority explicitly. Freedom in the modern state is therefore not abolished, but fragmented, parceled into options, choices, menus, and preferences, giving the appearance appearance of autonomy while ensuring that all available paths remain compatible with systemic stability. Fear now works through responsibility rather than threat, because individuals are told they are fully accountable for outcomes that are structurally constrained, which transforms failure into personal fault and obedience into rational self-interest. The citizen becomes both the subject and the enforcer, monitoring their own speech, moderating their own opinions, calculating their own risks, and internalizing the logic of the system so deeply that external pressure becomes almost unnecessary. What distinguishes modern fear from ancient fear is not its intensity, but its subtlety, because it does not demand submission through pain, but invites adaptation through foresight, teaching people to anticipate consequences long before any rule is broken. This fear is reinforced through constant measurement, through data that quantifies behavior, through scores that rank worth, through profiles that predict risk, and through classifications that define normality, creating a society in which individuals learn to live as permanent candidates for approval. The modern state presents itself as rational, scientific, and objective, claiming that decisions are made by processes rather than people, which makes fear harder to resist because it appears impersonal, inevitable, and beyond negotiation. Humans fear freedom not because freedom is harmful, but because freedom removes the structures that once absorbed uncertainty, responsibility, and blame, leaving the individual alone with choices that cannot be delegated, justified by authority, or softened by obedience. And this psychological exposure triggers ancient survival mechanisms that interpret open possibility not as opportunity, but as risk. Freedom demands choice, and choice demands evaluation. And evaluation demands the ability to imagine failure, which activates the same neural pathways that once protected early humans from predators and danger, meaning that the modern mind often reacts to freedom as if it were standing in front of an unknown threat rather than an open horizon. When no rule tells you what to do, no tradition tells you what is acceptable, and no authority tells you what is correct, the mind must generate its own framework, and for many people this internal effort feels exhausting, destabilizing, and frightening because certainty, even when restrictive, reduces cognitive load, while freedom multiplies it. Humans are not naturally comfortable with unlimited choice, because unlimited choice removes the illusion of safety created by boundaries, and boundaries have historically been associated with protection, predictability, and survival, which is why people often feel calmer inside systems they criticize than outside systems they desire. Freedom also removes excuses because when actions are freely chosen, outcomes are personally owned, and success cannot be attributed to luck alone, while failure cannot be blamed on coercion, which turns freedom into a psychological mirror that reflects responsibility back onto the individual without distortion. This is why many people unconsciously prefer systems, rules, ideologies, and even oppression, as long as these structures provide a clear explanation for suffering, because a world where pain is assigned meaning feels safer than a world where pain is random and responsibility is individual. Freedom creates uncertainty, and uncertainty activates anxiety because the human brain evolved to predict outcomes as a way to survive. And when outcomes cannot be predicted, the brain fills the gap with worst-case scenarios, making freedom feel like danger even when no immediate threat exists. The fear of freedom is also the fear of isolation, because independent choice separates individuals from collective norms, and separation has historically meant exclusion, vulnerability, and death, which is why social belonging often feels more important than personal autonomy, even in societies that celebrate individuality. Humans fear freedom because freedom requires self-definition, and self-definition requires confronting internal contradictions, desires, fears, and limitations, that are easier to ignore when identity is prescribed by culture, religion, class, or state, meaning that freedom removes not only external constraints, but also comforting identities. There is also a deep fear of moral responsibility embedded in freedom, because when no authority defines right and wrong absolutely, individuals must negotiate ethics internally, and this moral ambiguity creates discomfort, doubt, and internal conflict that obedience conveniently eliminates. Obedience simplifies life because it transforms complex moral landscapes into binary rules, allowing individuals to feel righteous without reflection, secure without understanding, and justified without accountability, which is why freedom often feels heavier than submission. Psychologically, humans are more comfortable with permission than with autonomy, because permission implies safety, while autonomy implies exposure, and exposure implies risk, which explains why people often ask not "what do I want?" but "what is allowed?" even in free societies. Freedom also threatens identity stability, because when people are free to change, they are also free to fail, contradict themselves, disappoint others, and lose social approval, which activates the deep fear of rejection that once meant expulsion from the group and near certain death. This fear is reinforced by modern systems that equate worth with performance, visibility, and success, turning freedom into a constant evaluation process where every choice feels like a test, making individuals long for simpler structures where expectations are clear and outcomes are predictable. Humans therefore often seek to escape freedom by surrendering decision-making to leaders, ideologies, algorithms, traditions, or systems, not because they are ignorant, but because delegation reduces anxiety and restores a sense of order. This psychological tendency explains why authoritarian systems repeatedly re-emerge even after revolutions, because fear of uncertainty eventually outweighs the desire for autonomy, and people trade freedom for stability once again. Humans fear freedom not because freedom is violent or destructive by nature, but because freedom removes the protective illusion that someone else is responsible for outcomes, decisions, failures, and consequences, leaving the individual alone in front of uncertainty with no authority to obey, no rule to hide behind, and no system to blame, which triggers deep psychological anxiety rooted in survival instincts rather than rational thought. Freedom forces the human mind into a state of constant decision-making, and decision-making requires evaluating risks, imagining future outcomes, and accepting the possibility of error. And the brain, which evolved to avoid danger rather than explore possibility, interprets this open-ended responsibility as a threat rather than an opportunity, activating fear responses that once protected early humans from predators and environmental dangers. When a person is free, there is no clear path labeled correct, no guaranteed approval, no external validation that the chosen direction is safe. And this absence of certainty creates mental strain, because certainty, even when restrictive, reduces cognitive effort, while freedom multiplies it, forcing the individual to think, judge, and choose continuously without rest. Freedom removes the comfort of permission, because permission implies safety and legitimacy, while autonomy implies exposure, and exposure implies vulnerability, which is why people often feel calmer when told what to do than when told they may do anything, because rules absorb anxiety while freedom amplifies it. Humans fear freedom because freedom demands ownership of failure, and failure experienced under freedom cannot be attributed to authority, fate, or coercion, meaning that mistakes become personal rather than structural, and personal failure threatens identity, self-worth, and social standing far more intensely than failure imposed by external power. Freedom also destroys the psychological refuge of obedience, because obedience offers moral insulation, allowing individuals to believe they are good simply because they followed rules, whereas freedom requires moral judgment, and moral judgment requires confronting ambiguity, contradiction, and doubt, all of which create discomfort that obedience conveniently eliminates. The fear of freedom is inseparable from the fear of isolation, because autonomous choice separates individuals from collective norms. And throughout evolutionary history, separation from the group meant vulnerability, exclusion, and death, which is why humans instinctively associate belonging with safety and independence with danger, even in societies that glorify individuality. Freedom forces self-definition, and self-definition requires individuals to confront who they are without inherited roles, prescribed identities, or imposed expectations, meaning that freedom removes not only external constraints, but also internal excuses, leaving the individual face to face with unanswered questions about purpose, values, and direction. Humans fear freedom because freedom destabilizes identity, as it allows change, contradiction, and reinvention. But identity instability threatens social acceptance, and social acceptance has historically been essential for survival, which explains why people often prefer rigid identities provided by ideology, religion, nation, or class over the anxiety of self-created identity. Freedom creates moral responsibility without moral certainty, because when authority no longer defines right and wrong absolutely, individuals must negotiate ethics internally, and internal moral negotiation produces doubt, guilt, and anxiety, whereas externally imposed morality provides clarity, even when it is unjust. The psychological burden of freedom is intensified by the fact that freedom exposes inequality of outcome, because when people are free, differences in success become visible, and visible inequality produces comparison, envy, shame, and self-blame, making freedom emotionally painful rather than liberating for many individuals. Humans fear freedom because freedom removes predictable narratives, replacing them with open-ended stories where outcomes are unknown and meaning must be constructed rather than inherited. And constructing meaning requires emotional resilience that many people were never trained to develop. This fear is reinforced by social systems that equate freedom with performance, turning autonomy into a constant evaluation process, where every choice feels like a test, every failure feels public, and every deviation feels risky, which makes individuals long for simpler systems, where expectations are clear and judgment is external. Jesus of Nazareth did not arrive in history as a general, a king, or a revolutionary in the traditional sense, because he carried no army, commanded no territory, and wrote no laws. Yet the system that ruled his world reacted to him as if he were one of the most dangerous threats it had ever encountered, which already tells us something essential about the kind of freedom he represented. He lived in a world dominated by layered power, where the Roman Empire enforced political control through military presence and legal authority, while local religious institutions maintained social order through moral law, ritual obligation, and fear of exclusion, creating a society in which obedience was expected not only to rulers but to tradition, hierarchy, and inherited identity, and where freedom was limited, conditional, and carefully monitored. Jesus did not openly call for rebellion against Rome, which is precisely what made him unsettling, because instead of attacking power directly, he questioned its foundations, not by denying authority outright, but by shifting the focus of freedom away from political structures and into the inner life of the individual, a move that threatened every system built on fear, control, and external obedience. He spoke of a kingdom, but not one that could be mapped or defended, not one that could be taxed or patrolled, but one that existed within, which immediately destabilized both imperial and religious authority, because a kingdom that cannot be controlled externally renders external control incomplete, fragile, and ultimately insufficient. Jesus consistently reframed freedom as liberation from fear rather than liberation from rulers, teaching that the deepest chains were not Roman laws or religious rules, but guilt, shame, moral terror, and the constant anxiety of judgment. And this message quietly dismantled the psychological mechanisms that kept people obedient long before it ever challenged political power. He told people that the Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath, which was not merely a theological statement, but a radical reordering of authority, because it suggested that rules existed to serve life, rather than life existing to serve rules, undermining a system that depended on unquestioned obedience to tradition. By forgiving sins without temple rituals, priestly mediation, or institutional permission, Jesus disrupted the monopoly of religious authority, offering freedom from moral debt without payment, sacrifice, or fear, which was intolerable to a system that maintained control through regulated forgiveness and structured guilt. His association with outcasts, the poor, the sick, and the socially excluded was not an act of charity alone, but a declaration that dignity did not need approval, that worth was not earned through compliance, and that freedom was not reserved for the obedient, a message that directly threatened social hierarchies maintained through fear of exclusion. Jesus spoke repeatedly against fear, telling people not to worry about tomorrow, not to fear those who could harm the body but not the soul, not to live under constant anxiety about survival, reputation, or divine punishment, which weakened the emotional grip of systems that relied on fear to maintain order. What made Jesus particularly dangerous was that he offered freedom without replacing it with a new external authority, because he did not say, "Obey me instead," but rather called individuals to internal transformation, responsibility, and ethical awareness, which meant that freedom came with accountability rather than submission. This form of freedom was psychologically destabilizing because it removed excuses, leaving individuals responsible for their choices without the comfort of blind obedience. And responsibility without fear is far more threatening to power than rebellion driven by anger. Jesus did not seek to destroy the law, but to fulfill it by relocating it from external enforcement to internal conscience, which meant that obedience could no longer be measured by compliance alone, and authority could no longer rely on visible conformity as proof of control. His teachings blurred the boundary between sacred and ordinary life, suggesting that freedom was not achieved through separation, purity rituals, or institutional belonging, but through compassion, humility, and ethical action, which made control through fear increasingly ineffective. As his influence grew, it became clear to religious authorities that this message would eventually erode their legitimacy, because a population that no longer feared divine punishment, mediated by institutions, would no longer accept institutional dominance as necessary, and a population that believed forgiveness was accessible would no longer tolerate systems built on guilt. Roman authorities, meanwhile, recognized a different threat, because although Jesus did not organize armed resistance, any movement that redefined loyalty, authority, and identity outside imperial structures carried the potential to destabilize order, especially in a province already tense with unrest and expectation. The charge against Jesus was political rather than theological, because he was accused of claiming kingship, not because he ruled, but because the idea of a different kind of authority challenged the empire's exclusive claim to sovereignty, and empires cannot tolerate alternative centers of allegiance, even symbolic ones. Jesus was executed not because he failed, but because his vision of freedom worked too well, because people listened, because fear loosened its grip, because obedience no longer felt inevitable, and because systems built on control recognize psychological liberation as an existential threat. Crucifixion was a public, humiliating, and terror-inducing punishment designed to restore fear, to remind the population that authority still controlled life and death, and to erase the possibility that freedom could exist without submission. Yet paradoxically, this act transformed Jesus into a symbol whose message survived precisely because it addressed fear at its deepest level. After his death, the movement did not disappear because the freedom he taught did not depend on his physical presence. It lived in an idea that could not be executed, imprisoned, or silenced. An idea that told people they were no longer defined by fear, guilt, or external authority. Over time, this message would itself be institutionalized, regulated, and sometimes weaponized. But the original psychological rupture remained because Jesus had demonstrated that the most effective challenge to power is not violence, but the removal of fear from the human heart. Jesus of Nazareth did not overthrow an empire, but he exposed its limits, showing that control over bodies is incomplete without control over belief, and that once fear dissolves internally, external domination becomes fragile. His legacy is not a political system, but a question that continues to unsettle authority. What happens when people are no longer afraid? And that question, more than any army or rebellion, is why Jesus was executed and why he remains one of the most disruptive figures in the history of freedom. Malcolm X did not enter history as a figure meant to reassure, unify, or calm society, because from the very beginning his presence functioned as disruption rather than reconciliation, forcing both the oppressed and the powerful to confront uncomfortable truths about freedom, violence, fear, identity, and responsibility, truths that could not be softened without losing their meaning. He was born into a world where freedom existed on paper but fear existed in daily life, where legal rights did not translate into safety, dignity, or equality, and where Black existence in America was shaped not by abstract liberty, but by constant vulnerability, humiliation, and the silent threat of violence, making freedom feel distant, conditional, and deceptive. Malcolm learned early that systems often speak the language of freedom while operating through fear, because his father was killed under suspicious circumstances linked to racial terror. His family was destroyed by institutional neglect, and the message embedded in his childhood was clear. Obedience did not guarantee safety, and patience did not guarantee justice. His early descent into crime was not rebellion against freedom, but a symptom of its absence. Because when a society denies dignity, meaning, and opportunity, individuals seek power wherever it is available, even if that power is destructive. And prison became the place where Malcolm encountered not only discipline, but consciousness. In prison, Malcolm discovered that ignorance was not accidental but engineered, that fear thrived where knowledge was denied, and that liberation required clarity before reconciliation, which is why his transformation was not gentle but sharp, intellectual and uncompromising, because clarity often feels violent to systems built on denial. As he emerged into public life, Malcolm rejected the comforting narrative that freedom would arrive through patience, gradual reform, or moral appeal alone, arguing instead that fear structured American society far more deeply than goodwill, and that a people conditioned to accept suffering as normal would never be free unless they first reclaimed the right to defend themselves, their dignity, and their existence. What terrified power was not Malcolm's anger, but his refusal to accept fear as natural, because he exposed how fear operated selectively, how violence against Black communities was normalized while resistance was criminalized, how obedience was demanded without protection, and how calls for nonviolence often functioned as tools to preserve order rather than justice. Malcolm's insistence that freedom included the right to self-defense was not a call to chaos, but a psychological rebalancing, because a population that cannot imagine defending itself internalizes fear, while a population that acknowledges its right to resist begins to dismantle fear internally, even before systems change externally. He spoke in absolutes not because he lacked nuance, but because nuance had been weaponized against the oppressed, used to delay justice, dilute urgency, and maintain comfort for those not under threat, making his language deliberately sharp, confrontational, and unsettling because comfort was the enemy of transformation. Unlike leaders who framed freedom as integration into existing systems, Malcolm questioned whether systems built on fear could ever truly deliver freedom, suggesting instead that liberation might require separation, self-definition, and the reconstruction of identity outside frameworks that had historically dehumanized Black existence. This made him profoundly threatening because he did not merely ask for inclusion, he challenged legitimacy, exposing the contradiction of a nation that celebrated liberty while enforcing inequality. And by naming this contradiction directly, he removed the psychological cover that allowed society to believe in its own innocence. Malcolm's evolving thought complicates his legacy because as he broke from rigid ideology and broadened his understanding of global oppression, colonialism, and shared humanity, he did not soften his critique of power but deepened it, recognizing that fear was not only racial but structural, international, and deeply embedded in political and economic systems. His journey toward a more expansive humanism did not negate his earlier insistence on self-respect and resistance, but reframed it, showing that true freedom requires both internal liberation from imposed inferiority and external challenge to systems that profit from fear. What made Malcolm uniquely dangerous was that he demanded responsibility rather than sympathy, asking people to stop begging for acceptance and start asserting dignity, a demand that destabilizes power because it shifts agency away from institutions and into the hands of individuals who no longer define themselves through fear. Václav Havel entered history not as a conqueror, a general, or a revolutionary who promised immediate change, but as a quiet and persistent challenger of fear itself, a man who understood that the most durable form of oppression is not violence, but normalization, and that the most radical form of freedom is not rebellion, but truth, spoken in a world trained to lie. He lived under a system that did not rely primarily on terror or mass executions, but on something far more psychologically effective: routine obedience, bureaucratic pressure, and the silent expectation that everyone would participate in a shared fiction, pretending to believe what they knew was false in order to avoid inconvenience, punishment, or exclusion, which made fear ordinary, invisible, and deeply internalized. The totalitarian system Havel confronted did not demand enthusiasm, only compliance, and it did not require belief, only silence, which allowed it to function smoothly while appearing stable, rational, and inevitable, creating a society where freedom was not violently crushed, but slowly eroded through habit, resignation, and the quiet fear of standing out. Havel recognized that such a system survives not because it is powerful, but because people adapt to it, because they learn to live within the lie, adjusting their language, behavior, and even thoughts to avoid friction, and in doing so, they become participants in their own unfreedom without ever feeling openly oppressed. Unlike traditional revolutionaries, Havel did not argue that freedom would come from seizing institutions, overthrowing leaders, or imposing a new ideology, because he understood that fear rooted in everyday behavior cannot be removed by force alone, and that replacing one system with another without changing how people relate to truth would only reproduce the same psychological structures under a different name. His most dangerous idea was also his simplest: that freedom begins the moment an individual refuses to live a lie, because this refusal breaks the internal contract between fear and obedience, exposing the system's dependence on participation rather than coercion, and revealing that power is often weaker than it appears once fear dissolves internally. Havel described how even small acts of truth, such as refusing to repeat slogans, declining to perform meaningless rituals, or choosing honest language over safe language, could destabilize authoritarian systems, not because these acts were dramatic, but because they disrupted the invisible web of conformity that held the system together. In his analysis, fear was not maintained primarily through punishment, but through uncertainty, because people never knew exactly where the boundary lay, which encouraged self-censorship, caution, and preemptive obedience, creating a population that disciplined itself without needing constant surveillance. Freedom, in Havel's vision, was therefore not loud or heroic, but deeply uncomfortable, because it required individuals to accept risk, ambiguity, and moral responsibility without guarantees, which is why so many people avoided it, even while privately resenting the system that denied it. Havel rejected the idea that people were simply victims of totalitarianism, insisting instead that they were morally implicated, not in the crimes of the system, but in its everyday functioning, because by adapting to lies, they helped sustain the structure that limited their own freedom, a claim that was deeply unsettling precisely because it returned responsibility to the individual. This emphasis on responsibility rather than innocence distinguished Havel from many freedom fighters, because he did not frame liberation as a struggle between good people and evil rulers alone, but as a psychological process that required individuals to confront their own fear, convenience, and desire for safety. When Havel was imprisoned, the state attempted to break him not through torture but through isolation, boredom, and humiliation, strategies designed to erode identity rather than extract information, because the system understood that silencing truth required exhausting the person who spoke it rather than destroying their body. Yet imprisonment only clarified Havel's insight that fear loses its power when it is named, understood, and accepted, because once an individual stops organizing their life around avoiding punishment, the system's leverage weakens dramatically, even if material conditions do not immediately improve. After the collapse of the regime, Havel's ascent to political leadership revealed another dimension of his philosophy, because he consistently warned that freedom achieved through political change alone is fragile, and that without moral responsibility, truthfulness, and civic courage, democratic systems can quickly reproduce the same fear-based dynamics under more subtle forms. Joan of Arc entered history not as a trained soldier, a political strategist, or a member of the ruling elite, but as a young peasant girl in a world rigidly structured by hierarchy, obedience, and fear. And it is precisely this fact that made her one of the most destabilizing figures of her age, because she represented a form of freedom that could not be easily categorized, controlled, or dismissed. She lived in a time when freedom was not imagined as individual autonomy, but as loyalty to crown, church, and inherited order, where identity was fixed by birth, gender, and class, and where stepping outside one's assigned role was not only disobedient but dangerous, making Joan's very existence as a leader an implicit challenge to the social architecture of medieval Europe. France, fractured by war, occupation, and internal division, was ruled as much by fear as by force, because prolonged conflict had normalized suffering, uncertainty, and submission, and people learned to survive not by questioning authority, but by enduring it, which created a society desperate for stability, yet terrified of disruption. Joan did not arrive with a political manifesto or a revolutionary ideology, but with certainty, and certainty is often more threatening than weapons, because it bypasses negotiation, undermines doubt, and exposes the fragility of systems built on hesitation, fear, and procedural legitimacy. Her claim to divine guidance was not merely a religious assertion, but a psychological rupture because it bypassed established channels of authority, refusing priestly mediation, aristocratic lineage, and institutional permission. And in doing so, it suggested that legitimacy could emerge outside approved structures, a notion intolerable to both church and state. What made Joan particularly dangerous was not that she questioned power directly, but that she embodied an alternative source of authority, one rooted in conviction rather than office, faith rather than institution, and personal certainty rather than inherited rank, which destabilized systems that depended on obedience to visible hierarchies. By leading armies despite her gender and status, Joan did not simply defy social norms. She exposed them as conventions rather than necessities, revealing that many limitations presented as natural were in fact enforced through fear, habit, and repetition rather than divine or rational law. Her presence on the battlefield functioned as psychological liberation because she transformed fear into momentum, replacing resignation with belief. And belief is a powerful force in societies accustomed to defeat, because it allows people to imagine a future beyond survival, even if only temporarily. Joan's freedom was not articulated as rights or autonomy, but as purpose, as alignment with something larger than fear. And this made her immune to many of the pressures that kept others compliant, because fear loses power over those who believe their actions carry transcendent meaning. Yet this same freedom made her profoundly vulnerable, because systems tolerate obedience but punish independence, and Joan's refusal to submit her authority fully to either military command or ecclesiastical interpretation marked her as uncontrollable, unpredictable, and therefore dangerous. When political tides shifted, the same institutions that once benefited from her courage moved quickly to neutralize her, because power often accepts disruption only as long as it remains useful, and once usefulness ends, fear demands elimination rather than accommodation. Her trial was not a search for truth, but a ritual of containment, designed to strip her of legitimacy, isolate her psychologically, and force her back into a framework of obedience through intimidation, theological traps, and the constant threat of death, revealing how deeply authority fears individuals who operate outside sanctioned fear structures. Joan was interrogated not primarily for what she had done, but for who she claimed to be, because identity outside institutional approval is inherently destabilizing, and her insistence on personal conviction over imposed interpretation threatened the Church's monopoly on meaning and the state's monopoly on obedience. Her execution was not only punishment but pedagogy, a public lesson designed to reassert fear, restore hierarchy, and warn others against similar acts of autonomy, because burning the body was meant to cauterize the idea that freedom could emerge from outside sanctioned roles. Yet the paradox of fear-based power is that it often immortalizes what it seeks to erase, because Joan's death transformed her from a military figure into a symbol, and symbols travel more freely than armies, crossing borders, generations, and ideologies. Joan of Arc did not live long enough to see freedom institutionalized, and she did not articulate a philosophy of rights or governance, but she demonstrated something far more unsettling to power. Freedom is one of the oldest words humans ever believed in, but it may also be one of the greatest illusions in history. From the very beginning, humans dreamed of freedom. Yet every civilization that spoke about it also built systems to control it. In ancient societies, freedom was never universal. It was selective. In Athens, the birthplace of democracy, only a small group of men were considered free. Slaves built the city where freedom was celebrated. Rome praised liberty, yet chained millions. Freedom existed, but only for those powerful enough to define it. This raises a disturbing question. Was freedom ever a natural human right? Or was it always a privilege disguised as an ideal? Throughout history, freedom was often promised during moments of crisis. Revolution spoke its name loudly. The French Revolution declared liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yet soon after, terror followed. New rulers replaced old masters. Chains were removed from the body, but placed on the mind. History shows a pattern. Freedom is announced at the beginning of change, then restricted once order is restored. Philosophers noticed this contradiction early. Some argued that humans fear true freedom. Freedom means responsibility. It means uncertainty. It means the absence of someone to blame. Many people preferred security over liberty, rules over chaos, obedience over risk. Empires understood this well. They offered protection in exchange for control, and people accepted. Even in modern times, freedom remains complicated. We are freer than ever before, and yet more observed, regulated, and influenced than any generation in history. We can speak, but our voices are shaped. We can choose, but our choices are guided. Freedom today rarely looks like chains. It looks like comfort. History suggests something uncomfortable. Freedom is not a permanent state. It is a tension, a struggle between the desire to act and the need to belong. Every era redefines it, limits it, and reshapes it according to fear, power, and belief. So perhaps the real question is not whether humanity was ever free. Perhaps the question is whether humans truly want freedom, or only the idea of it. Because throughout history, freedom was always closest during moments of collapse, rebellion, and uncertainty. And once stability returned, freedom quietly stepped back into the shadows. If freedom was ever achieved, it was never free. Every step toward it demanded a sacrifice, and history is crowded with people who paid prices they never fully understood when they began. Freedom did not arrive through comfort. It arrived through loss, through choices that stripped away safety, certainty, identity, and sometimes even meaning itself. The first thing humans gave up for freedom was security. For most of history, obedience offered protection. Empires promised food, order, and survival in exchange for submission. To reject that system meant hunger, exile, or death. Those who chose freedom accepted the terrifying reality of standing without guarantees. They traded predictable suffering for uncertain hope. And many paid with their lives before knowing whether their choice mattered at all. People also gave up belonging. Freedom often meant becoming an outsider. Rebels were not only hunted by the state, they were rejected by neighbors, families, and friends who feared the consequences of association. To seek freedom was to risk loneliness. History remembers revolutions as collective movements, but the decision to resist always began alone. Before crowds formed, there were individuals who chose isolation over silence. Another sacrifice was identity. Slaves who escaped, citizens who rebelled, thinkers who challenged authority, all lost the labels that once defined them. They became traitors, criminals, heretics. Names that once gave them place in society were replaced with marks of danger. Freedom demanded the destruction of old identities before new ones could even be imagined. Many never lived long enough to reclaim a new self. Freedom also demanded the surrender of moral simplicity. Choosing freedom meant accepting responsibility, not only for one's own actions, but for the consequences that followed. When old systems collapse, new suffering often emerges. Those who fought for freedom had to live with the knowledge that their actions caused chaos, violence, and uncertainty. History rarely allows freedom without blood on the hands of those who seek it. This burden haunted generations of revolutionaries who wondered whether the cost was justified. Perhaps the most painful sacrifice was time. Some people gave entire lifetimes to the idea of freedom without ever experiencing it themselves. They lived in prisons, in exile, under surveillance, believing that future generations might inherit what they could not. This kind of sacrifice is the quietest and the hardest to honor. It requires faith without reward. To fight for a freedom you will never see is to accept meaning without fulfillment. Freedom also stripped away illusions. Those who reached it often discovered it was not what they imagined. Political freedom did not guarantee economic justice. Legal freedom did not erase inequality. The dream collapsed into complexity. New systems formed, new controls emerged, and the realization followed. Freedom is not a destination. It is a condition that must be defended endlessly. Many who fought for it later felt betrayed by what replaced the old order. History shows that humans did not only give up chains for freedom, they gave up comfort, certainty, unity, innocence, and sometimes hope itself. And yet, they continued to choose it, again and again. Not because freedom guaranteed happiness, but because life without it felt incomplete. In the end, freedom was never about winning. It was about refusing to accept a life where choice was denied. Even when freedom failed, even when it was taken back, the act of reaching for it changed something irreversible inside humanity. It proved that obedience was not the natural state of the human spirit, and perhaps that is the deepest truth history reveals. Freedom survives not because it is achieved, but because humans continue to sacrifice for it, knowing full well that it may never fully belong to them. In the modern world, freedom no longer demands chains to be broken. It demands permissions to be accepted. The sacrifices of today are quieter, more comfortable, and far harder to notice. People are not asked to give up their lives for freedom. They are asked to give up pieces of themselves, slowly, willingly, and often gratefully. The first sacrifice is privacy. In exchange for convenience, safety, and connection, modern humans allow themselves to be seen, tracked, and recorded. Cameras watch streets, phones listen for commands, platforms collect habits, desires, fears. Unlike the surveillance of old empires, this one is not enforced with soldiers. It is downloaded, accepted, agreed to with a tap. Freedom today often comes with a condition: be visible to exist. Another sacrifice is attention. Never before has the human mind been so fragmented. Endless feeds, notifications, and algorithms shape what people see and think. Choice still exists, but it is guided. Opinions feel personal, yet they are often predicted. The freedom to think independently now requires effort, resistance, and discipline. Many trade that effort for comfort. Control no longer silences voices, it drowns them in noise. People also give up time, not to prisons or exile, but to systems that blur the line between work and life. Constant availability replaces rest. Productivity becomes identity. Freedom to choose when to stop slowly disappears. The modern individual is rarely forced to work, but is subtly convinced that stopping means falling behind. Exhaustion becomes normalized. Burnout becomes invisible. Modern freedom also demands the surrender of certainty. Economic systems promise opportunity but offer no guarantees. Jobs vanish overnight. Skills expire quickly. Stability is replaced with flexibility, which sounds liberating until it becomes permanent insecurity. Freedom to move, choose, and adapt exists, but at the cost of roots, long-term safety, and peace of mind. Perhaps the most profound sacrifice is truth. In the age of information, reality fragments. Multiple versions of truth coexist, compete, and cancel each other out. Freedom of expression expands, but shared understanding shrinks. When everything can be questioned, nothing feels solid. This creates a new kind of dependence, not on authority, but on belonging. People cling to groups, narratives, and identities that offer certainty, even if they limit thought. And yet, despite all this, modern humans still believe they are freer than ever. In many ways they are. They can speak, travel, choose, create. But freedom today is not taken away by force. it is negotiated away in exchange for speed, comfort, security, and connection. This reveals a final paradox. In the past, people sacrificed everything to gain freedom. Today, people sacrifice freedom to maintain everything else. The struggle has not disappeared. It has changed shape. The battlefield is no longer public squares and prisons. It is screens, habits, and invisible systems. Freedom in the modern era is not lost, but it is fragile. It survives only where individuals choose awareness over ease, depth over distraction, and responsibility over comfort. History suggests this pattern will continue. Freedom will never vanish completely, but it will always ask a price, one that each generation must decide whether it is willing to pay. Freedom is one of the most powerful words humans have ever created, and one of the least agreed upon. Everyone wants it, many fight for it, yet few can clearly define what it actually is. Throughout history, freedom has meant different things in different times, but at its core, freedom has never been simply the absence of chains. It has always been the presence of choice. At the most basic level, freedom is the ability to decide one's own actions without coercion. It is the space between impulse and command, between fear and obedience. A free person is not someone who can do everything they want, but someone who is not forced to do what they fundamentally reject. This distinction matters because total freedom has never existed. Every society limits behavior. What changes is who sets the limits and whether individuals have a voice in shaping them. Philosophically, freedom exists in tension with responsibility. To be free means to accept the consequences of one's choices. This is why freedom is often feared as much as it is desired. It removes excuses. When there is no master, no absolute authority to blame, the individual becomes accountable. History shows that many people are willing to surrender freedom not because they are weak, but because responsibility is heavy. Security, rules, and structure can feel safer than uncertainty. Freedom also has an internal dimension. A person may live in a free society and still be unfree. Fear, ignorance, addiction, social pressure, and desire for approval can restrict the mind more effectively than laws. Philosophers have long argued that true freedom begins within, when a person can think independently, question beliefs, and resist manipulation. Without inner freedom, external freedom becomes fragile and easily surrendered. At the same time, freedom is never purely individual. Humans are social beings. Absolute freedom for one can become oppression for another. This is why freedom has always required balance. Laws, ethics, and mutual limits exist not to destroy freedom, but to prevent it from turning into domination. The paradox is that some constraints are necessary for freedom to survive collectively. Historically, freedom has often emerged during moments of crisis. Empires collapse, old systems fail, people resist. But once stability returns, freedom is redefined, narrowed, and managed. This pattern suggests that freedom is not a permanent state, but a process. It must be constantly defended, renegotiated, and reimagined. When people stop questioning power, freedom slowly erodes, not through violence, but through habit. In the modern world, freedom has become increasingly subtle. People can speak, move, and choose, yet their attention, data, and behavior are constantly shaped. This does not mean freedom is gone. It means it has changed form. Today, freedom depends less on breaking chains and more on awareness of systems, incentives, and influences that operate invisibly. Ultimately, freedom is not doing whatever one wants. It is the ability to choose meaningfully, to say no without fear, to act according to conscience rather than force. It is fragile, uncomfortable, and often costly. But history shows that whenever humans lose it entirely, they eventually try to reclaim it, because life without choice may be stable, but it is never fully human. Freedom, then, is not a destination. It is a condition of dignity, and every generation must decide how much of it they are willing to protect, trade, or surrender. Freedom was rarely taken from humanity all at once. It was not usually stolen in a single moment of violence or conquest. Instead, throughout history, freedom was removed slowly, systematically, and often with consent. What truly stripped freedom from human hands was not only force, but fear, belief, and habit. The first great enemy of freedom was fear. Early societies learned that frightened people are easier to control than defeated ones. Fear of hunger, invasion, gods, punishment, or chaos pushed individuals to surrender autonomy in exchange for protection. Rulers promised safety, order, and stability, and in return demanded obedience. Over time, fear normalized submission. When survival feels uncertain, freedom begins to feel like a luxury rather than a necessity. Another force that took freedom away was absolute authority. Kings, emperors, and ruling classes claimed power not as a temporary responsibility, but as a natural right. Many justified this authority through divine claims, ancestry, or destiny. When power was presented as sacred or inevitable, resistance became immoral or sinful. People were taught that questioning authority was not just dangerous but wrong. In this way, freedom was not only suppressed, it was redefined as disobedience. Tradition and custom also played a powerful role. Practices repeated for generations stopped being questioned. Social roles became fixed. Gender, class, caste, and birth determined a person's place in the world. Over time, limitations felt natural rather than imposed. When people grow up inside a system, they often mistake familiarity for freedom. History shows that many forms of oppression survived not because they were enforced violently every day, but because they were inherited unquestioned. Freedom was also taken through economic dependence. Those who control resources control choices. In feudal systems, slavery, and later industrial societies, people were bound not by chains alone, but by need. When survival depends on pleasing a master, an employer, or a system, choice becomes theoretical. Economic pressure quietly replaces physical force. A person may be legally free, yet practically trapped. Another major force was ideology. Belief systems, religious, political, or national, often demanded loyalty in exchange for meaning. Ideologies offered identity, purpose, and belonging, but at a cost. Independent thought became dangerous. Doubt became betrayal. Once people internalized the rules, control no longer needed constant enforcement. Freedom disappeared not because it was forbidden, but because it was unthinkable. Control of information further eroded freedom. When people cannot access truth, compare perspectives, or question narratives, choice becomes illusion. Throughout history, those in power restricted knowledge, censored ideas, and shaped education. A population that cannot imagine alternatives cannot choose them. Ignorance became one of the most effective prisons ever built. Perhaps most dangerously, freedom was taken through normalization. Over time, extraordinary restrictions became ordinary. Surveillance became protection. Obedience became virtue. Silence became wisdom. What once would have provoked rebellion slowly turned into routine. When loss of freedom becomes normal, resistance feels unnecessary or even foolish. History also shows that freedom was often taken in the name of order. Chaos, real or exaggerated, justified control. Revolutions promised liberty, then centralized power to protect it. Emergency measures became permanent. Temporary limits became permanent systems. In these moments, freedom was not destroyed by enemies, but postponed indefinitely. In the end, what took freedom from humans was not only oppression from above, but surrender from within. People traded freedom for safety, certainty, belonging, identity, and comfort. They did so rationally, gradually, and often believing they had no alternative. This is the hardest truth history teaches. Freedom is rarely stolen outright. It is given up, piece by piece, until one day people look back and realize they no longer remember what having it truly felt like. And yet, history also shows something else. Whenever freedom is lost completely, the human spirit eventually reacts. Resistance returns, questions resurface, and the cycle begins again. Because while freedom can be taken from human hands, it is never erased from human desire. Freedom is one of the oldest words humans ever believed in, but it may also be one of the greatest illusions in history. From the very beginning, humans dreamed of freedom. Yet every civilization that spoke about it also built systems to control it. In ancient societies, freedom was never universal. It was selective. In Athens, the birthplace of democracy, only a small group of men were considered free. Slaves built the city where freedom was celebrated. Rome praised liberty, yet chained millions. Freedom existed, but only for those powerful enough to define it. This raises a disturbing question. Was freedom ever a natural human right? Or was it always a privilege disguised as an ideal? Throughout history, freedom was often promised during moments of crisis. Revolution spoke its name loudly. The French Revolution declared liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yet soon after, terror followed. New rulers replaced old masters. Chains were removed from the body, but placed on the mind. History shows a pattern. Freedom is announced at the beginning of change, then restricted once order is restored. Philosophers noticed this contradiction early. Some argued that humans fear true freedom. Freedom means responsibility. It means uncertainty. It means the absence of someone to blame. Many people preferred security over liberty, rules over chaos, obedience over risk. Empires understood this well. They offered protection in exchange for control, and people accepted. Even in modern times, freedom remains complicated. We are freer than ever before, and yet more observed, regulated, and influenced than any generation in history. We can speak, but our voices are shaped. We can choose, but our choices are guided. Freedom today rarely looks like chains. It looks like comfort. History suggests something uncomfortable. Freedom is not a permanent state. It is a tension, a struggle between the desire to act and the need to belong. Every era redefines it, limits it, and reshapes it according to fear, power, and belief. So perhaps the real question is not whether humanity was ever free. Perhaps the question is whether humans truly want freedom, or only the idea of it. Because throughout history, freedom was always closest during moments of collapse, rebellion, and uncertainty. And once stability returned, freedom quietly stepped back into the shadows. Václav Havel entered history not as a conqueror, a general, or a revolutionary who promised immediate change, but as a quiet and persistent challenger of fear itself, a man who understood that the most durable form of oppression is not violence, but normalization, and that the most radical form of freedom is not rebellion, but truth, spoken in a world trained to lie. He lived under a system that did not rely primarily on terror or mass executions, but on something far more psychologically effective. Routine obedience, bureaucratic pressure, and the silent expectation that everyone would participate in a shared fiction, pretending to believe what they knew was false in order to avoid inconvenience, punishment, or exclusion, which made fear ordinary, invisible, and deeply internalized. The totalitarian system Havel confronted did not demand enthusiasm, only compliance, and it did not require belief, only silence, which allowed it to function smoothly while appearing stable, rational, and inevitable, creating a society where freedom was not violently crushed, but slowly eroded through habit, resignation, and the quiet fear of standing out. Havel recognized that such a system survives not because it is powerful, but because people adapt to it, because they learn to live within the lie, adjusting their language, behavior, and even thoughts to avoid friction, and in doing so, they become participants in their own unfreedom without ever feeling openly oppressed. Unlike traditional revolutionaries, Havel did not argue that freedom would come from seizing institutions, overthrowing leaders, or imposing a new ideology, because he understood that fear rooted in everyday behavior cannot be removed by force alone, and that replacing one system with another without changing how people relate to truth would only reproduce the same psychological structures under a different name. His most dangerous idea was also his simplest, that freedom begins the moment an individual refuses to live a lie, because this refusal breaks the internal contract between fear and obedience, exposing the system's dependence on participation rather than coercion, and revealing that power is often weaker than it appears once fear dissolves internally. Havel described how even small acts of truth, such as refusing to repeat slogans, declining to perform meaningless rituals, or choosing honest language over safe language, could destabilize authoritarian systems, not because these acts were dramatic, but because they disrupted the invisible web of conformity that held the system together. In his analysis, fear was not maintained primarily through punishment, but through uncertainty, because people never knew exactly where the boundary lay, which encouraged self-censorship, caution, and preemptive obedience, creating a population that disciplined itself without needing constant surveillance. Freedom, in Havel's vision, was therefore not loud or heroic, but deeply uncomfortable, because it required individuals to accept risk, ambiguity, and moral responsibility without guarantees, which is why so many people avoided it, even while privately resenting the system that denied it. Havel rejected the idea that people were simply victims of totalitarianism, insisting instead that they were morally implicated, not in the crimes of the system, but in its everyday functioning, because by adapting to lies, they helped sustain the structure that limited their own freedom, a claim that was deeply unsettling precisely because it returned responsibility to the individual. This emphasis on responsibility rather than innocence distinguished Havel from many freedom fighters, because he did not frame liberation as a struggle between good people and evil rulers alone, but as a psychological process that required individuals to confront their own fear, convenience, and desire for safety. When Havel was imprisoned, the state attempted to break him not through torture but through isolation, boredom, and humiliation, strategies designed to erode identity rather than extract information, because the system understood that silencing truth required exhausting the person who spoke it rather than destroying their body. Yet imprisonment only clarified Havel's insight that fear loses its power when it is named, understood, and accepted, because once an individual stops organizing their life around avoiding punishment, the system's leverage weakens dramatically, even if material conditions do not immediately improve. After the collapse of the regime, Havel's ascent to political leadership revealed another dimension of his philosophy, because he consistently warned that freedom achieved through political change alone is fragile, and that without moral responsibility, truthfulness, and civic courage, democratic systems can quickly reproduce the same fear-based dynamics under more subtle forms. Freedom. It is one of the most spoken words in human history, and one of the least experienced realities. Everyone claims to want freedom. Kings, empires, revolutionaries, even tyrants. And yet, there is a strange pattern that repeats itself across time. The moment freedom appears, fear follows. This video is not an accusation. It is not a manifesto. It is a question. Why has freedom throughout history almost always been built on fear. When we open history books, freedom never emerges during calm and stable times. Freedom is born after war, after famine, after oppression, after blood has already been spilled. Freedom appears at the breaking point, when fear becomes unbearable. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. Freedom is demanding. To be free means to decide, to choose, to take responsibility for consequences. Fear, on the other hand, offers something deeply tempting: relief from responsibility. When people are afraid, they obey. When they obey, they feel protected. And history has learned how to use this. Let us go back to the earliest human communities. Early humans were not free, but they were not enslaved either. They lived in a world ruled by danger, hunger, cold, predators, other humans. Nature did not offer freedom, it offered threat. In such a world, survival mattered more than liberty. People gathered together not to be free, but to be safer. Rules emerged, leaders appeared, hierarchy formed, and those leaders were not chosen for kindness. They were chosen for strength, for dominance, for the ability to intimidate, because fear creates order faster than trust ever could. This is the first paradox of freedom. Human beings did not unite to gain freedom. They united to reduce fear. As societies grew, this mechanism did not disappear. It simply became more sophisticated. Fear turned into law. Law turned into authority. Authority turned into the state, and freedom remained conditional. Philosophers tell us that freedom is humanity's highest value. History tells us something darker. People fight for freedom only after it is taken away. Freedom is rarely protected proactively. It is defended reactively. We do not feel freedom when we have it. We only recognize it when it disappears. And that delay is dangerous, because freedom becomes an emergency response, not a guiding principle. Look at every major movement for freedom in history. The French Revolution did not begin with philosophy. It began with fear of starvation. American independence did not begin with ideals alone. It began with fear of external control. The abolition of slavery did not begin with abstract morality. It began with the unbearable reality of total dehumanization. Freedom was never the first motivation. Fear was. Freedom was the answer to fear. Here lies the second paradox. People do not seek freedom because they love it. They seek freedom because they can no longer tolerate fear. Freedom becomes an escape route, not a destination. Now we arrive at a far more uncomfortable question. If freedom is born from fear, what happens to fear once freedom is achieved? History gives a clear answer. Fear does not disappear, it transforms. Fear once had a face, a king, an emperor, a ruler. Then fear became law. Then fear became institutions. Today, fear is invisible, but it is everywhere. Modern humans believe they are free, yet they are monitored, measured, categorized, conditioned. Freedom exists, but within boundaries. Is this freedom, or is it fear redesigned to feel acceptable? Throughout history, freedom has never been absolute, because absolute freedom requires absolute responsibility, and responsibility is heavy. Fear, by contrast, is comfortable. Fear allows decisions to be outsourced to systems, to leaders, to structures. This is not a flaw. It is human nature. Fear protects us, but it also makes us governable. This documentary will not try to prove a single theory. Instead, it will follow a single question. From the first human communities to modern surveillance states, from primitive fear to digital control, why does freedom always begin with fear, and why does it never fully escape it? Perhaps the problem is not freedom itself. Perhaps the problem is that we remember freedom only after fear has already shaped the world. Now, let us return to the beginning, to a time before freedom had a name, when fear already ruled. Because this story starts there. In the modern age, Freedom is rarely taken by chains, prisons, or visible force. It is taken quietly, wrapped in convenience, safety, and progress. Unlike the past, where freedom was seized through violence or conquest, today it is often surrendered willingly, one small decision at a time. One of the strongest forces limiting freedom today is comfort. Modern systems are designed to make life easier, faster, and more efficient. In exchange, they ask for very little resistance. When life becomes comfortable, questioning becomes tiring. People stop asking who controls the systems they rely on because those systems work well enough. Freedom fades not because it is forbidden, but because it feels unnecessary to defend. Another powerful factor is surveillance disguised as protection. Cameras, data collection, tracking, and monitoring are justified in the name of safety and personalization. Unlike past surveillance states, this one does not rely on fear alone. It relies on consent. People agree to be watched to gain access, convenience, and visibility. Over time, being observed feels normal. And when observation becomes normal, self-censorship replaces control. People adjust behavior before they are ever told to. Economic pressure remains a quiet enemy of freedom. Modern individuals are technically free, yet deeply dependent. Debt, rising costs, unstable employment, and constant competition limit real choice. When survival depends on performance, reputation, and constant availability, freedom becomes theoretical. Saying no feels risky. Slavery is gone, but dependence remains, more complex and less visible. The modern era also takes freedom through attention control. Algorithms decide what people see, hear, and think about. Information is abundant, but focus is scarce. When attention is fragmented, deep thought becomes rare. People believe they are choosing freely, yet their choices are constantly shaped by invisible systems optimized for engagement, not truth. Freedom of thought still exists, but it requires effort most are too exhausted to sustain. Another loss comes from identity pressure. Modern society encourages individuals to define themselves through labels: political, social, cultural, ideological. These identities offer belonging, but they also impose limits. Once a person fully merges with an identity, disagreement feels like betrayal. Thought narrows, freedom becomes conditional on loyalty to the group. In the past, rulers demanded obedience. Today, communities often do. Fear has not disappeared, it has changed form. Fear of being excluded, canceled, left behind, or forgotten replaces fear of physical punishment. Social consequences can be just as powerful as legal ones. When people fear losing status or connection, they limit their own speech and choices. Freedom erodes without a single law being passed. Perhaps the most dangerous loss is awareness. Modern control does not need to hide. It operates openly because people are distracted. When life moves too fast, reflection feels like a luxury. Without reflection, freedom becomes an abstract word rather than a lived experience. People feel free because they can choose between options, but rarely question who designed those options. In the modern world, freedom is not removed by force. It is negotiated away in exchange for comfort, speed, security, and approval. This makes it harder to recognize and harder to resist. There is no clear enemy, no single oppressor, no dramatic moment of loss. History shows that freedom does not disappear suddenly. It fades when people stop noticing it. And in the modern era, the greatest threat to freedom is not oppression, but distraction. Freedom still exists, but today it survives only where individuals choose awareness over ease, responsibility over comfort, and thought over noise. The question of our time is not whether we are free, but whether we are paying attention enough to remain so. History does not end with freedom. It pauses there. Because every time humanity has moved closer to freedom, it has discovered something unsettling, that fear does not disappear when chains are broken. It changes shape. We have seen it again and again. In ancient tribes, fear created order. In empires, fear created obedience. In religion, fear moved into the soul. In revolutions, fear turned into terror. In modern states, fear became invisible. And still, people kept fighting. Jesus challenged fear by removing guilt. Joan of Arc challenged fear by acting beyond her role. Malcolm X challenged fear by refusing comfort. Václav Havel challenged fear by living in truth. Different paths, same cost. Freedom has never been free. Not because power refuses to grant it, but because fear refuses to leave us. Perhaps the most difficult truth is this: the greatest enemy of freedom is not tyranny alone, but the artifice that prefers safety to responsibility, certainty to choice, obedience to courage. History shows us that chains are easy to recognize, but invisible fear is much harder to confront. And yet, every generation faces the same question, even if it asks it in different words. What are we willing to risk to be free? Freedom does not arrive as a final victory. It arrives as a decision made again and again and again. And that decision is never made without fear. If this journey through history made you pause, if it made you question what freedom really means, leave a like. And if you want more stories about power, fear, and the fragile courage it takes to be human, subscribe to the channel. Because history doesn't just tell us what happened, it quietly asks who we are becoming. Freedom has never come without fear. It only comes after someone decides not to obey it. History doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to those who dared to resist. If this story made you think, leave a like. And if you want more quiet truths from history, subscribe. Because freedom begins the moment fear loses its voice.